Hello there, this is Mr. Bowles. This is the first of the War and Transformation of British Society revision podcasts. This is about Britain in Depression, which covers the period 1931 to 1939. The reason we're doing these podcasts is to make it a little bit more interesting than just reading out of Ben Walsh or the revision guide and taking notes. You can listen to it on the way to school, you can listen to it on the bus, you can listen to it at home. I suggest you listen to it once and then you listen to it again and take a few notes, and hopefully it's going to prompt your memory before the big exam in the summer. So, the Great Depression. This was a massive financial collapse that happened in the United States. You don't need to know exactly why it happened, but you do need to know that Britain was badly affected by it due to the trade links and financial links between Britain and America. So Britain lent money to America, America lent money to Britain. We traded lots of commodities and products, and as a result, when the Great Depression hit America, it had a ripple effect on Britain as well as many other countries, as you know from your Germany topic. The four main industries impacted were, firstly, coal. The coal industry was particularly badly hit, with the steel industry, the textiles industry, and the shipping industry, or the shipbuilding industry. Why were these failing most significantly? Well, firstly, the Depression led to a lack of demand. It was compounded by the fact that the First World War was over, and during the war there'd been a huge boom in shipbuilding in order to ferry products from America to help with the war effort, and also to provide warships. Demand was falling after this. Also, the demand from coal and the demand for textiles was falling because other countries were able to produce it for much cheaper, which brings us on to our next reason, which is foreign competition. So, for example, Scandinavia was much more able to produce ships at a lower cost than Britain was. Coal could be mined much cheaper in places like India and China, where it was where they had to pay their workers less, and also they were able to use the latest in new technology, which had not yet come over to Britain. For example, in textiles, there were all new kinds of looms for weaving, which were making fabric be produced at a much faster rate for a much lower cost. Even though Britain had led the world in the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, we were now starting to lag behind other places who were able to produce things at a much higher rate at a much lower cost. So how did the government respond to this? They weren't just going to sit around and let people starve to death. Well, let's see. So there was a new coalition government. A coalition government is where more than one party come together to form the government of the country. In this case, it was the Labour and the Conservative and the Liberal Party. It was led by this man, who is called Ramsay MacDonald. He was the Prime Minister. He was from the Labour Party. Backing him up was Neville Chamberlain, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, which means that he's in charge of all the government finances and taxation and things like that. Coalitions are significant because they only really happen in times when there is seen to be a need for parties that are normally in competition to work together. So obviously the country was in dire need. There were millions of unemployed and businesses were failing left, right and centre. They decided we need to put our differences aside, we need to stop our petty political squabbling, and we need to work together in the national interest, which is why this coalition was formed. It was called the National Government. Very easy to remember. National is the nation, the country, and government means government. So the National Government. So what did they do? Well, they decided that the best thing to do to save the government's poor financial situation was to have a 10% cut on the wages of government employees. That means teachers, civil servants, and other people that are paid for by the government. Did this work? Well, it cut the finances, but it made many people poorer. The government employed a huge proportion of the population, and all of those people are finding themselves less well off. The second thing is that they decided to come off the gold standard. The gold standard is where the government holds gold, like you have in your jewellery, in reserves in the Bank of England, and the value of the currency is measured against how much gold the government has. In theory, you would be able to take a £5 note to the Bank of England and say, I want my £5 worth of gold from your gold reserves. That's what the £5 notes say. They say, I promise to pay on demand the bearer the sum of £5, and that means £5 in gold. However, they came off the gold standard. This was actually a good thing because it meant the value of the currency could change, and it actually decreased the value of the pound, and it meant that the cost of British exports went down. So other countries were buying British products more, which was helping British industry. So that was good. They also introduced a 10% tariff, which is a tax on imported products. This means that other countries would have to pay a 10% tax if they wanted to import their products to Britain. The idea was that this would protect British businesses because they weren't going to have so much competition from foreign companies. However, this just encouraged other countries to do the same, which actually meant that in the end, British industry had to pay tariffs in other countries as well. Another thing they did was the Ottawa Agreement. This was a deal they made with Commonwealth countries. So Commonwealth countries are places like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and those countries that were once part of the British Empire. So they got preferential trading treatments. They didn't have to pay tariffs. That was good because it allowed free trade in the Commonwealth. Another thing is amalgamation. Amalgamation means when lots of smaller countries are brought together to form a larger company. They're supposed to be more efficient. They can share their resources. They can share their administration, and therefore, hopefully, they won't sack as many workers if they're doing badly in their business. Unfortunately, this didn't quite work because rather than saving employees, it actually made more people unemployed, and it caused many small businesses to shut down. Another thing they did was the Special Areas Act, which was where they tried to encourage businesses to be set up in areas where they had been particularly hardly hit by the Depression. This didn't work, unfortunately, because it was only setting up businesses in areas that hadn't been hit that badly. So, for example, the Midlands, where they tried to make people set up the motor industry, was doing all right, and places like Leicestershire, where they tried to encourage the setting up of high-tech electronics industries, were also not that badly hit. However, places like the northeast, like Jarrow, which we'll talk about in a second, were not helped at all, and they were where some of the worst unemployment was. Finally, the means test. This was a way of the government saving money by deciding how much people earned or how much money people had as a way of justifying whether or not they deserved to have the dole, which was unemployment benefits. This caused misery, hardship and humiliation to many, as we'll find out in a second. I'm going to give the national government's policies a U because they only got 2 out of 7 for successful policies, so that's a pretty poor showing for the national government. You're going to have to try better next time. So what was life like for the unemployed? Well, the means test, it's really mean. So the means test, like I said, was this way of assessing whether people were poor enough to receive benefits. The impact this had on people was the following. Firstly, it was seen as very intrusive because the government would send a means test inspector to your house to rummage through your possessions and decide how poor you were. So they'd go through your family heirlooms, they'd go through your drawers, they'd look at your silverware, etc., and they would encourage you to sell anything of value before you could claim the dole. It broke families apart because not only the stress of having the inspectors rummaging through your personal life, also it put pressure on people to kick out anybody that was earning money in their family. So, for example, a mother might send a father who was earning a small amount, doing a few menial jobs here and there, might kick them out of the house because their earnings would count against the dole. So people would be forced from their homes by their families, and it would cause divides between them. Finally, it was seen as really humiliating because it was very obvious when the government inspectors arrived at someone's house, the neighbours would gossip. You know, they'd say, oh, look how poor they are, they need to get on the dole. People in those days were very private about their financial situation. This was seen as a humiliation, so it was extremely unpopular. Another impact of the Depression was the fact that malnutrition was common. For example, eggs and meat were extremely rare, and there was a generation of children that grew up actually stunted because of the lack of food or decent food that they received during this. The workers who were unemployed, they didn't just sit around, they organised themselves into the National Unemployed Workers Union, which was a way of them getting together to show the government their dire situation. They organised things called hunger marches, and a famous example of a hunger march was the Jarrow Crusade. So, this is a very famous event in the northeast of England. They have a statue in the town of Jarrow to commemorate it. It's a real kind of local legend. It was essentially all down to the shutting of this place, which is Palmer's Shipyard. It had been the biggest employer in the town. When it shut down in 1935, it resulted in 70% of the people of Jarrow becoming unemployed. So, there it is, 70%. This lady, Ellen Wilkinson, who was the local MP, she was a Labour Party MP, but she'd formerly been a communist. So she was seen as a bit of a troublemaker. She decided that she was going to do something about it. She organised the unemployed men, and she decided that they were going to do a hunger march to London to raise publicity for the plight of the town. So the march went from Jarrow, up there in the northeast of England, right down to London. It was going to travel 280 miles, and it was going to stop at 22 stops. On the way, they were welcomed by people. They had their shoes repaired, they were given food, and they were generally quite well looked after, except for 1 or 2 stops where they were associated with communist activity and they were not welcomed. However, in most places, they received a pretty warm welcome. They carried a petition which had 22,000 signatures, which asked for the government to do something to try and help the unemployed of Jarrow. There's a lovely lady there showing off the Jarrow petition and the Jarrow banner that they actually used. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister, Baldwin, was too busy to see them. So Stanley Baldwin was Ramsay MacDonald's successor. He was also the leader of the national government. However, he was too busy to see the protesters. In reality, the government did not want to encourage hunger marches because they thought that it would lead to communist agitation and general public disorder. So, there are 10 key words or people that I think you need to learn to be able to do well in this part of the unit. So, number 1, Jarrow Crusade. Number 2, the means test. Number 3, Ellen Wilkinson. Number 4, the national government. Number 5, the Great Depression. Number 6, Hunger March. Number 7, Ramsay MacDonald. Number 8, tariffs. Number 9, Palmer's Shipyard. And number 10, Ottawa Agreement. If you can tell yourself or tell a friend what all of those keywords mean, you are well on the way to knowing this topic really well. So have a look at those words, make sure you know them, and make sure you are revising them. The next podcast should be along soon. Please give us feedback on how helpful you think it is. Either comment underneath or tell us in person whether you think they're helpful, what you'd like to hear more of in future podcasts, and we'll hopefully make them happen. Thanks very much. Enjoy your revision.